I don't think that's arguable. I think actually the single greatest contribution, besides the tremendous games that we got from the NES, because those were tremendous first-party games, was the licensing system. I mean, that was essentially what brought the video game industry out of the depths, out of the laughable depths of total, basically just being tossed off the shelves, laughed off the shelves. No market for video games,
basically. And what led the charge in the bastion of good games, great games that the Nintendo had, was Super Mario Brothers, which held the title of best-selling console video game until just very recently, when it was replaced by Wii Sports. Okay, so that's something we can argue about.
I don't even know if I'd really even replace that, because, come on.
It replaced in sales, but not in our hearts.
Yeah, I mean, please.
But regardless, I mean, you had...
Wii Sports is fun for, 5 minutes? 10 minutes.
At least 10. Anyway.
Okay. Anyway.
You had the births of so many...
Still play Super Mario Brothers. It's still fun.
So many great series. Super Mario, Zelda, Metroid...
Castlevania. I mean, we're getting out of first
Final
party.
Fantasy. Dragon Quest. I mean...
Mega Man.
Ridiculous, awesome.
Right. I mean,
games.
The series that kind of speak for themselves. Series that we could do entire podcasts on in and of themselves.
And it was I believe it was the word of mouth. Little Johnny on the playground says, "Hey, I got Super Mario Brothers. You should come play it." And then the other kids play it. Like me, I played it at someone else's house. I'm like, "Holy crap! I need this game system." That's why it was so successful.
And you look in the magazines and you see, "Oh my gosh, this Castlevania game! You have, let me get this straight. You have this guy that's hunting vampires with a whip. I have to play this game." Mm-hmm. And I think so. I think you're right. The word of mouth really helped to bring Nintendo to the forefront. But at the essence of it, I mean, let's go ahead and use your criteria. Games were absolutely the central part of the winning formula, both in terms of licensing and quality for the Nintendo. All right, innovation. We were talking about the innovation being the licensing. I mean, I think that in and of itself is enough. You could talk about some things. There was a light gun.
I mean, those are the Rob and the light gun, the zapper, the power pad.
I don't know that I put Rob and the light gun in the same category. I know they're both accessories, but I mean...
they're all kind of...
One is a gaming accessory, one that really kind of pushes the genre forward, and one is kind of a gimmick.
I really wouldn't call any peripheral sold after the fact.
Oh, I can tell this is definitely going to get interesting as we go through the generations.
I wouldn't call anything like that a real innovation.
I mean, fair enough. At this point, I don't think I would have disagreed with you. If you look back circa 1988, I certainly think that's the case. I don't think you can basically judge any kind of console generation on its peripherals.
I would say people bought the Nintendo for Super Mario and not for Duck Hunt.
Right.
Even though they were both packaged.
Absolutely. Good. So the NES really holds up, and folks, this is we're clearly hitting a softball out of the park here, because the NES really, now I don't know what the real market share was in America, but I've heard it's very, very, very high.
I've heard things like 90% in certain books.
It would not surprise me if the NES had 90% market share in America around that same time, around 1988, pre-Genesis. It was dominant, and there's really nothing else you can say about that.
So we won.
Okay, so now it gets interesting, because I think, well, I mean, I'm probably going to say something like that for every generation, because it got interesting for every generation. Really, there was a different kind of battle that happened. Even though I think your criteria is good, and it probably holds true pretty well throughout generations.
That's where it gets the most fuzzy, I would say.
Yeah, well, and maybe that's what I'm saying by interesting. There's a different kind of battle going on. The last generation with the NES, with the Master System, was just trying to posit video games as a viable home entertainment solution. They were trying to show that you could actually sell video games in homes for home consoles at all, because people really didn't think that was possible. Now that they've shown it's possible, the game gets the stakes get higher. Video gaming is becoming a very big market at this point, and we have the 4th generation of consoles. Are you going to put your star out there now? Oh, there we go. Those of you watching on video right now, you're seeing the visual aids. You're seeing the Zelda cartridge from the NES get replaced by Final Fantasy III for Super Nintendo.
Quite possibly the best game
ever made.
Ever.
I would argue, but that's just
I would,
another podcast for another time.
I would really argue that this is the golden age of console gaming
that
we're talking about right here.
Ooh,
I would argue that.
I think that
the pinnacle of 2D gaming, at least.
Well, of course, but I think that's. I would argue that it's not, and the reason why it's not is because of how incredibly popular the next few generations become on console. But certainly for our generation, this is the golden age in terms of nostalgia. Whenever games get too complicated, like an old codger, I jump back to the Super Nintendo generation and go, look how simple these games were that were so much fun.
They were simple. You could have small little indie house studios make these great games that could be distributed by the larger houses.
Right.
And you would have lots of 16-bit gems.
Oh gosh.
That could you could just go out and find.
Shameless plug.
That would just warm the subcockles of your heart.
At least he didn't name any of the games.
For months
okay,
on end.
so
such as Illusion of Gaia.
Right, yeah, there. I knew it had to
or
come out at
EVO,
some
Search
point.
for
EVO.
Eden. We also have
bless
Star Trek,
America.
Starfleet Academy, or Toe Jam and Earl.
All right, well,
Funkatron.
now that there we go. Now we're getting to
Or
true 16-bit classics.
Earthbound.
Oh,
Earthbound.
I knew he was going to bring up the Earthbound.
Developed by Ape Incorporated, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Shigatsu Itoi, I believe.
Yes.
You say his name. One of the quirkiest, funniest, awesomest RPGs ever. And
if
of course,
you are a complete loser.
Came out during this generation.
Right.
So run
now
down
let's
the consoles.
before we get into some awesome games from this generation, let's talk about the combatants. Well, okay, we've got some good games. We certainly have one awesome game right smack in the middle of the table right here. That was definitely an awesome game. Let's talk about the combatants again. Let's talk about the consoles that are going up against each other at this particular moment in time. And again, we're talking here 1991, 1990, up till about 1995, 1996, when the next generation really begins to take over.
Yeah.
So let's start with the SNES, 1991. Okay. Pretty much the direct successor of the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yes.
You have the Sega Genesis, which is the successor to the Sega Master System, and that debuts in 1989. So it gets a pretty significant head start on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, it was actually, I think, meant as a direct competitor to the NES when it first came out.
Absolutely.
So
hence the Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Exactly. And if you read the book Game Over, it's the making of Mario. It's had different subtitles during its time, but it is a great look into the history of Nintendo up until about the early 90s.
Right.
Very intensive, and it talks about such things as Nintendo in the 80s would have been fine resting on their haunches, resting on their laurels, and just riding the NES until the money stopped being printed.
Sure.
But Sega came out with the Genesis, and that's really what pushed the Super Nintendo out the door.
And you have the essence of competition really coming in, and I think it's a great thing because it made those innovations that you're looking for in these generations come forth.
Yep.
Because those innovations certainly wouldn't have been very interesting if we had to wait 10 years for the Super Nintendo.
Marketplace at work, folks.
Good. All right, cool. So we've got the Genesis 1989. The TurboGrafx 16, which has become kind of a darling of the Virtual Console.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough.
I was not much into the TurboGrafx 16, but a lot of people our fans.
Also debuted in 1989, which is, I would say, kind of more indicative than the Genesis, because a lot of the TurboGrafx-16 games, to me, are more NES-like. The Genesis really does seem like a very significant step forward, whereas the TurboGrafx-16 games kind of seem like a halfway point for me between the generations. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I've never been terribly impressed by the TurboGrafx, but you have things like Bonk's Adventure,
and not that Bonk wasn't a good game. It was. It just wasn't. To me, it wasn't Super Nintendo level.
Not terribly innovative.
Right. And Bonk eventually makes it to the Super Nintendo.
Yeah.
So. Okay, so after TurboGrafx, we've got the Neo Geo, which debuts in 1991. The ridiculously expensive Neo Geo. I did have some friends, actually, that had a Neo Geo.
I must have been hanging out in the wrong circles.
It was, it's not that, Neo Geo at that time, I remember going to, I don't know, the Pizza Huts of the world and playing the Neo Geo, because they had, the reason that the restaurants loved the Neo Geos because they had like 10 games in one. It wasn't that many, folks. It was probably like 4 or 5, but they were, I remember it as 10 because that's the hyperbole of nostalgia. But, you remember a bunch of games. You could sit down and play Samurai Showdown or, any of the games that were really popular on Neo Geo with one arcade cabinet. But the Neo Geo at home, it looked almost exactly the same. It was like having an arcade-powered machine at home.
You probably could have bought an arcade machine for about the same price.
Certainly arguable, especially back then, circa 1991. You probably could have bought a whole full arcade cabinet.
Right. How much was that back in the day?
Let me see here. I don't actually have that number. I don't have. It was. I think it was
$650.
Yeah, it was either $650 or $700. So it's a pretty expensive system at that moment. When you consider that. The PlayStation 3 was expensive at $600 in 2006. You have the Neo Geo selling for $600 in 1991.
With my handy inflation calculator I have in front of me, that would be right around $1,000 in 2008 money.
Golly, $1,000! Could you imagine spending dropping $1,000 on the newest video game system?
Apparently, not many people could.
Well, the Neo Geo didn't sell the Neo Geo didn't sell obviously like the NES, but I don't know that they ever actually wanted to. I think it was not a direct competitor in that sense. I think they were going for a different market. It just so happens that market happened to be smaller.
Yes. So Neo Geo didn't win this round.
Certainly not. But I've got more. We've got also the Sega CD, which debuts kind of at the end.
Kind of its own thing.
It's kind of its own thing because, remember, we've got the Genesis, and the Sega CD becomes the kind of bridge between the Genesis and the Saturn. It's kind of the bastard child. It's kind of that forgotten kid.
When Sega was in its crazy accessories phase, it's been a year, let's put something else out.
The 32X.
Went over like a turd in a punch bowl.
Right. And it was difficult. Sega ran into a lot of problems. We'll talk about that in just a minute, about why they couldn't compete. And lastly, surprising to me, because I don't remember it specifically at that particular moment, is the CDI, the Compact Disc Interactive, which debuted in 1990. I actually had a CDI.
I remember that.
I'm very excited that Mad Dog McCree has come out for the Wii, because I used to play Mad Dog McCree with the light gun peripheral on my CDI.
Jocko.
Huh?
Show them what we do to troublemakers.
That was basically how it went, folks. And that acting was
that over and over.
Except the acting you just heard there was vastly superior. Yeah, so anyway, full motion video, there were all kinds of interesting things that happened with the CDI, but the CDI, I think you could definitely make the argument, was not even in the same class. It was
like the Neo Geo. It was just this high-end $600-700 thing. They had a 30-minute infomercial, I remember.
Oh, absolutely.
If Philips can afford a 30-minute infomercial for their game system, it's going to be costing a pretty penny.
Well, that was also in the later years, lest we forget here, because yes, CDI debuts in 1990, but CDI was designed to do a lot more than just be a game system. CDIs actually Well, but it was used for kiosks in things like trade shows and even in retail, retail markets. It was supposed to be there so that people could experience digital video on a whole new level because it used